Alright, pathological altruism. The immigration and multiculturalism policies of Western societies are often described as pathological altruism. The implication of the phrase is that you can have too much of a good thing, that altruism is generally good, but it becomes pathological when it goes too far. Exactly when it becomes pathological is not specified by this view, but obviously when people say this, they're implying that the current policies of the West are pathological. Now, I reject this view. I reject the view that altruism is ever not pathological. In my view, altruism is always a pathology, and it is almost always a lie. People are not altruistic, so individual altruism cannot explain these policies. And this, by the way, is one of the ways in which I part from the white nationalists and the alt-right. They seem to think that altruism would be just fine if it were confined to white people or to a more insular in-group, and I disagree. But that's a bit of an aside. Anyway, to me, the challenge is not to explain why people are too altruistic or why altruism becomes pathological, but rather how this pathology of collective altruism could emerge from the behavior of selfish individuals. And that's what I'm going to explain in this video. I'm going to explain how this pathological collective altruism is a consequence of selfish individuals acting in their perceived self-interest. So I'm going to explain pathological altruism as a kind of collective irrationality. There are two main causes of collective irrationality: social delusions and tragedies of the commons. And I have talked about these before, but I will briefly describe each, and then I will explain how pathological altruism is a result of a social delusion and a tragedy of the commons. So, first of all, what are social delusions? Well, social delusions are caused by feedback and conformity. They occur when people's beliefs are selected mainly to conform with the beliefs of others, not to represent reality. And this is more common than you might think. In fact, it's probably the case that most of your beliefs, or at least most of the beliefs that you could express in language, are the result of conformity more so than actual experience, right? You don't have personal experience of very much. So a lot of the knowledge you have acquired was acquired by a synchronization process in which you kind of synchronize your beliefs about the world to the beliefs of people around you. And that's how you acquire a lot of knowledge. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Conformity is a very useful heuristic, but it can be taken too far, and it can generate delusions. And this happens when the basis for a belief is not something real, or the personal experience of people with reality or with the thing itself that is supposedly being represented, but it's entirely circular. The basis for everyone's belief in X is not experience with X, empirical evidence of X, but simply everyone else's belief about X. So the beliefs simply represent one another. It's entirely circular. An example of this is God, belief in God, or religion in general. There is no experiential basis for believing in God. You don't have any experiences that are explained by that idea. If you believe in God because people around you believe in God. Now, I'm not saying that religions and myths are arbitrary I'm not saying that, there aren't certain kinds of ideas that make better religions or myths than others. Definitely there are. And religions and myths can have functions that are very important, but they are still delusions. So social delusions are circular beliefs about the world, beliefs that don't represent reality, but just represent themselves, copies of themselves in other minds. Okay, now what is a tragedy of the commons? Well, a tragedy of the commons is caused by a situation in which each individual in a collective has an incentive to act against the collective interest. For example, let's say that a fishing ground could sustain a harvest of 100,000 tons of fish per year. And let's say that there are 1,000 fishermen who fish this fishing ground. Each of them could harvest 100 tons of fish per year sustainably. And they could do this for their entire lives and pass on the resource to their children. But if there is no regulation of their behavior, then there is no incentive for them to limit their harvest as individuals. Each individual fisherman will make more money if he harvests more fish, right? So if he harvests 200 tons of fish, he makes twice as much money. And that is true regardless of what the other fishermen do. Let's say, for example, that there is one rogue fisherman, one selfish fisherman who harvests 200 tons of fish, and all the other altruistic fishermen harvest 100 tons each. Well, the resource will slowly degrade, but the selfish fisherman will make a lot more money as it does, right? And if the other fishermen are truly altruistic, they will lower their catches to compensate for the declining resource. So he could actually fish 200 tons per year sustainably if everyone else was altruistic, because they would lower their catches to maintain the resource. In that case, he would be a free rider. He would be benefiting from their restraint, right? And the free rider problem is very similar to the tragedy of the commons. It's just a different way of looking at the same fundamental problem of cooperation. Now, if every fisherman is selfish, then they will all harvest 200 tons of fish per year. And let's say that's the maximum capacity of their fishing vessels, and that's the maximum they could realistically get out of the water. Then the fishing ground will be destroyed. The resource will collapse, and they will all lose their livelihoods. They will all go out of business in a couple of years. Nevertheless, if you know everyone else is going to do that anyway, you have no incentive to restrain yourself, right? If you decide unilaterally to restrain yourself to only fish 100 tons because that is sustainable, but everyone else fishes 200, well, then the resource is still destroyed, and you just make less money. You lose out, and everyone else benefits a tiny bit from your restraint. So that's a tragedy of the commons. Each individual has an incentive to overfish, even though it is against their collective interest, and everyone is harmed by the effects of these actions. Everyone loses. So that's a tragedy of the commons. It's any situation in which individuals can distribute the costs of their actions to the collective, but keep the benefits of their actions for themselves. Right? It's a kind of collectivization by the individual, not by the state. And libertarians should pay attention to this, because a lot of them don't seem to understand that collectivism can go both ways. There are two kinds of collectivism. One that is imposed on individuals by the state, and one that is imposed on the collective by individuals. The first kind, top-down collectivism, is when the state distributes the benefits of individual action to the collective, while individuals bear the costs of their actions. So for example, you might work really, really hard, and then you're paying the cost to be productive, but then the state takes away the products of your labor and redistributes them to everyone, including people who don't work as hard, right? And that's a problem. And that takes away the incentive to be productive, right? But there is another kind of collectivism, in which individuals distribute the costs of their actions to the collective, but keep the benefits for themselves. And that's bottom-up collectivism. And the problem with that is that individuals don't have an incentive not to be destructive, right? So the problem with bottom-up collectivism is that it is destructive, and the problem with top-down collectivism is that it is not productive. Okay, so there are those two kinds of collectivism. Each has a problem, and to create a functioning society, you need to solve both problems. And this is what libertarians don't seem to understand. And certainly the anarchists really don't get this, that anarchy doesn't work. Anyway, that's a topic for another video, though. Alright, so I'll give you another example of a tragedy of the commons that is a little bit simpler and that you have probably experienced. It is when you're in a crowded room or a crowded area, like, an airport lounge or something, and everyone is talking loudly because everyone has to talk over the noise of everyone else. It would be better for everyone if everyone talked in a quiet voice, right? So the right behavior in that situation is for everyone to be quiet, to speak quietly because they're in a crowded room. And if they did that, then they could all understand one another and they wouldn't have to shout. But that's not a stable state. That's not a stable equilibrium. Or, to use the terminology of game theory, it's not a Nash equilibrium. So what happens is, even if everyone starts out talking in a quiet voice, then there's an incentive for people to talk a bit louder, right? And then everyone has to keep increasing the volume, and eventually everyone is talking very loudly. So that's what happens in a crowded room. And that is another example of a tragedy of the commons. The collective outcome is worse than it could be. It is suboptimal because individuals have an incentive to do what is collectively harmful. All right. Now I will explain how the pathological altruism of the West is caused by a social delusion and a tragedy of the commons. The social delusion is altruistic morality. Altruism is the basic moral value of the modern West. We have discarded most of the moral values that we used to have, such as chastity, honesty, bravery, loyalty, etc. And we have replaced them with a single moral value: altruism, or being nice to others. And the reason why people believe that they should be nice to others, that this is good, is simply because everyone else believes it. Because that's part of the culture. There's no rational reason to believe it. There are some big problems with this principle, this idea that we should be nice to one another. One of them is that it's never really clear, it's never spelled out who you're supposed to be nice to and how nice you're supposed to be. These things are never made clear, they're never made explicit. They're just assumed. You're supposed to somehow figure these things out, or you're supposed to somehow intuit them. Just know them intuitively. But in practice, it doesn't really matter, because altruism is just a pretense. It's never actually applied in a systematic way. And if it were, it would fail catastrophically, because it doesn't work. Anyway, there are 3 parts to this delusion. One is that altruism is a moral imperative. The idea that you must be nice to others. This is something that is somehow just true. It's just an obvious fact or something like that. when in fact it's really just a cultural assumption. And it's sort of an ad hoc moral assumption. The other two assumptions that are part of this delusion are that people are altruistic by nature and that society is based on altruism. And both of these are false. People are not altruistic by nature. People are selfish by nature. We evolved to be selfish, to reproduce our genes, not to go around being nice to others. And society is based on cooperation, not altruism. And I know that there are some biologists who have confused things by calling cooperation reciprocal altruism. But this is an oxymoron. If you were doing something nice, so you will get something back in return, like if you will get a profit on your favor, then it's not altruism. It's selfishness. So anyway, there's a lot of confusion in biology, and a lot of biologists have really been quite stupid about this. And just in the same way that social scientists are deceived by their own moral assumptions and, they end up advocating for certain things rather than trying to understand reality, you get the same thing in biology. There's a very strong bias toward finding goodness in nature and not seeing nature for what it is, which is a struggle to exist. Anyway, I've got a bone to pick with certain biologists, but I'll skip that. So this idea of altruism, this altruistic morality, is a social delusion. And this delusion creates a virtue-signaling tragedy of the commons. Everyone wants to be good, right? Or at least to be perceived as good by others. Everyone wants to be perceived as altruistic. So they present themselves as being altruistic. But in fact, they are selfish. No one wants to pay the costs of real altruism because they're selfish. In their private lives, people are not altruistic. For example, they don't let homeless people sleep in their houses, right? They don't say, oh, sure, you're a homeless person, you can come and live in my house. They don't do things like that. They donate very little to charity. What they do is profess altruistic values in public. So instead of doing altruistic actions as individuals, they signal their moral goodness in public. And they do this usually with their political values or their social values, right? You can think of these as virtue signaling devices, ways of saying, I am a good person. And behind that facade, there is a selfish person who doesn't do anything that's altruistic. So people will promote bringing in illegal migrants, but they won't allow homeless people to sleep in their houses. Maybe they will bring a reusable shopping bag to Whole Foods, but, they drive their SUV there and back and they fly to Hawaii on vacation and, it's all hypocrisy. Because people aren't altruistic. So altruistic morality makes people into hypocrites. Or in other words, liars. And virtue signaling is a pretense. It is a pretense of altruism that covers up the reality of human nature. Now, this creates a divergence between public and private values. Or, in other words, between stated preferences and revealed preferences. Your revealed preferences are the preferences revealed by your actual choices. When you have a choice between two outcomes, and you can bring about one of the two outcomes by choosing it, then your choice reveals your preferences in that situation. For example, most of the people who claim to be anti-racist and racism is the worst thing ever, and I really like black people, blah, 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 they're just as likely to leave a neighborhood when it becomes more diverse or more black. And that's an example of a difference between their revealed preferences and their stated preferences. And there are many, many examples of stuff like that. And the simple way of saying it is that people are liars. People are liars and hypocrites. They say one thing and they do another. And so that creates a divergence between public and private values, because the values that people profess in public exist mainly for signaling virtue, not for guiding action. And this creates a tragedy of the commons, because individuals can collectivize the costs of their virtue signaling. So, for example, let's say that professing left-wing politics, like we should let in the migrants, we should give them welfare, we should help out everybody, blah, blah, blah. This is a good way to signal your virtue. You're altruistic. You have empathy. You care about other people. You are compassionate, right? This is a very cheap way to pretend to be that kind of person, to pretend to care about others, because you support this political party instead of that one, and you have this rainbow flag button on your backpack that says, "Love trumps hate." You know, stuff like that, right? It's just signaling. It costs you very little, right? But the collective result could be that the government actually acts on those public values. That the government is forced to act out the public preferences, the stated preferences of individuals, not their revealed or private preferences. And this is just like that fishing ground example. The individuals who virtue signal, they don't directly pay the costs of that. If no one else does it, then they still get the benefits of keeping out the immigrants, right? Or keeping out the migrants, or whatever it is. They still get the benefits of society being collectively selfish. On the other hand, if many other people are saying we should let in the migrants, we should help the refugees, or whatever it is, whatever the pathological altruism is, then if they signal against it, they are evil. And they pay a penalty for that, right? So they then are putting themselves on a moral low ground, which is a risky place to be, and they still pay the same costs, because the society will decide collectively to let in the migrants, to be pathologically altruistic. And so even if you take the opposing side with respect to that issue, you still pay the costs. So it is a virtue signaling tragedy of the commons. The costs of virtue signaling are paid by the collective, and the benefits are kept by the individual. In that situation, each individual has an incentive to signal his virtue at the expense of the collective. And the result is collective action that is harmful to the collective. And that's it. That's what explains pathological altruism.